Hello, my name is Aaron Kushel, and I'd like to thank you for watching and listening to my leadership biography presentation, whether by force or by choice. And thank you. I have threatened my children within an inch of their life to be very quiet during this presentation, and so hopefully all goes well there. So the onus is on me to do a good job. I'd like to thank my instructor and thank you to my teachers for allowing me the opportunity to learn with you and under you. The leadership book by Northouse and also the leadership spiritual leadership book has really been a challenge to me. It's been very helpful, and I've shown some of these traits, and I've also not shown many of these traits and approaches. And I'm looking forward to growing as a leader, and that's why we're all here, is it not? Let's go ahead and jump right into the biography here. Today, my biography is going to be on the life of Moses. And I would say that he's one of the more influential people in history, certainly in Israel's history. Let's go ahead and look at just a basic outline. Today, the presentation guide shows that we'll talk about Moses' life as a quick biography and then jump into the meat and potatoes of this presentation. We will start with the trait approach, leadership practices, as well as the authentic leadership approach. Both of those jump off the pages of Scripture. Had to talk about both of them. Well, the third one we'll look at is the transformational leadership approach, followed by the servant leader approach. And then we will conclude with the leader membership exchange theory as discussed and described by Nordhaus. I will close with some basic thoughts and really just a personal challenge to myself. And so let's go ahead and jump right in to the biography of Moses. Of course, a man that's known as one of the great leaders in human history, certainly one of the most influential people in Jewish history. His birth and his upbringing were miraculous. He's a character that we all know well, but most likely none of us have studied this life with these criteria applied. And so, again, described by Nordhaus and those leadership approaches that we've already mentioned, would Moses be considered a leader? I would say that in each of these approaches, yes, he had and would be described as a leader. However, we're not going to just look at where he succeeded. We're also going to look at some of his failures as a leader with regards to these approaches. He was great, but he was just flesh and bones. Moses is a sinner, just like every one of us. And God brought Moses into the world to essentially get Israel out of the world. And the world is Egypt. And Egypt is a picture of the world in the Old Testament. God was going to use a man guided by the Spirit of God and the help of God and the direction of God to allow God's chosen people to become less like the world, to lead them out of the world and into a land of God's promise. And wouldn't it be great if every one of us had the opportunity to do just that? My intent here is just to show his leadership style usage as it relates to these successes and failures. Meyer said in his book, "We make a profound mistake in attributing to these men extraordinary qualities. To do so is to miss the whole point of the reiterated teaching of Scripture." End quote. I don't want to just focus on his successes. I'd like to look at his failures as well. The children of Israel were not made for Egypt. The children of Israel were made for the land of promise, the land of Canaan. And Chuck Swindoll, in his book, mentioned this with his biography on Moses. And he kind of danced around that topic for quite a while. God used this man to bring other people into the place where they needed to be. And so God gave Moses influence and leadership positions in order to see other people grow in their relationship and usefulness and influence for Christ. Israel is in bondage at this time, and Egypt is her master. And so then you enter the life of Moses, a human tool in the hands of God to bring deliverance to his favored nation, Israel. Moses was born of a Jewish family. He was miraculously spared during genocidal attempts of Egypt's Pharaoh, who was trying to eradicate the growth and stop the growth of Israel, of the Israelites, from becoming too prominent in their really the place of God's blessing at that time. They were not again made to stay here in Egypt. God used the opportunity in Egypt really for them to be preserved, as Joseph had talked about. They had brought God had allowed them to be brought there just for preservation, and so they were not to stay in Egypt. They were not to stay there forever. They were to enter the land of God's promise. Moses was trained by the greatest teachers and instructors that the world had to offer. And during this time of upbringing, 40 years, his first 40 years in Egypt, of his life in Egypt, he couldn't shake his upbringing. He couldn't shake his God or his heritage, ethnicity, and connection to God's chosen people. And so at one point in his life, he decided that he was going to, if you will, divorce himself from uh, Pharaoh's family and not associate himself with Pharaoh's family, but identify with God's chosen people. Not long after this, while having a place of influence and leadership, a unique place, in a sinful moment of rage, Moses is found to become a murderer as he stands up against an abusive Egyptian taskmaster, killing him and then attempting to hide that murder. And once he realized that he had been found out, he had two choices: face the law, face death by the Pharaoh, or run for his life. And so what he does is he runs for his life. While he's in the wilderness for 40 years, he gets married and begins a different life there. But at one point, God would remove Moses off the shelf and put him back to use. Moses' life really erupts by a special visit by the God of his father Abram in a burning bush. During that um, time with God, he was commissioned to return to Egypt, to identify with his people in a servant leadership position, and then really just to lead an exodus out of Egypt, through the wilderness, and into the promised land. Meyer wrote this: the door, which had been so long in repairing, was suddenly put on its hinges again and opened. I like that analogy or that word picture. So now let's go ahead and look into or step into the mud, step into the clay with the Israelites as they're making bricks for the Egyptians, and just see the leadership qualities of their prodigal leader, Moses. And so we'll start here today with the trait approach as it's discussed by Nordhaus in his leadership book. I would say that Moses, in the trait approach, really showed some bad traits and also showed some good traits. Again, the Bible does not idolize um, or memorialize God's followers. It simply presents us a picture of God and the journey that many people throughout history have had in their time seeking Him, following after Him, and coming into a relationship with Him. So the Bible does not idolize its heroes, it merely represents who they are in an attempt to give us a more clear picture of who Christ is. The trait approach, he lacked self confidence, he lacked emotional stability. His lack of self confidence is seen in his response to God calling him back to Egypt. Um, all of his rebuttals, for instance, are littered with a lack of self confidence. As you look through Exodus chapter 2 and Exodus chapter 3 and 4, even after the comforting presence of God was promised to him, Moses said, "Who am I that I should go unto Pharaoh?" That's in Exodus chapter 3, verse number 11. He predicts that had he just showed up and told the Israelites what to do, that they would respond and say, "The Lord hath not appeared unto thee," which is an interesting thing to consider because God had literally just told Moses that they would understand that God had brought him to them. And he questions God and essentially almost calls God a liar by telling God, "Well, they won't believe that you appeared unto me," when God had just told them that he would. They would. Nordhaus refers to the big five, in quotes, the big five things that make up personality. The first of those five traits is neuroticism, which is described as, and I quote, the tendency to be depressed, anxious, insecure, vulnerable, and hostile. I would say categorically, you can really just go through that definition and see Moses all over it. In fact, maybe perhaps you could define neuroticism as, and I quote myself here, the tendency to be a Moses. He also showed a proneness to be emotionally driven, lacking in emotional intelligence and really just emotional stability. The case could be made for this in two areas. Firstly, instead of using his leadership influence and power to bring the offending taskmaster to accountability, what does Moses do? Well, he gets emotional, irrational, violent, to the point of premeditated murder and then trying to hide his murder. He showed a lack of emotional stability when he struck the rock instead of speaking to the rock. And so it's easy to pick Moses apart here and see his failures in the trait approach to leadership, the trait approach being traits that are shown in the life of a leader that help him in his leadership journey. I believe that it's fair, though, to look also at Moses' strengths with regards to the trait approach. And so, according to the VIA, or Values in Action classification, that's discussed in page 37 of Northhouse's book, Moses was strong in a couple of those areas. I would say that he was particularly strong in his wisdom and knowledge, as well as in his justice as he dealt with man. Uh, and Moses, of course, is an extremely scholarly man. For 40 years, he's trained under the smartest people in the world at the time. And so he's filled with knowledge. He's cognitively strong. Um, he was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, as Acts chapter 7, verse 22 states. He was trained by both God and man for leadership. And so, how did man train him? Man trained him how to lead people in Egypt, and God trained him for leadership in the wilderness. And so, bad traits and good traits. He had wisdom from heaven, and then he gained much of his knowledge and maybe cognitive skills and everything else from Egypt. Let's go ahead now and let's look into the next trait approach, and that would be the authentic approach. Um, the Bible um, the Bible says, "By faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter." And so we will here consider Moses' leadership as it relates to the authentic leadership style. Moses is a very strong example of utilizing authentic leadership, especially when he's in his prime in Egypt. So, around the age of 40 or so, um, we know that he, in and of his own volition, separates from Pharaoh's household and refuses to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Out of conviction and spiritual clarity, he chooses to really officially divorce himself, or disassociate himself with or from Pharaoh's house, and to, in essence, associate himself with, of all people, a suffering group of slaves. And so, really, instead of associating himself with robes and riches from Egypt, he takes on a different robe, a robe of suffering and identification with suffering people. And so it's no doubt that during this time, as he shows this type of leadership, as he associates himself out of great conviction and authenticity, no doubt God gives him influence with God's chosen people as he sees a man that has great riches, great honor, great knowledge, great influence, and a great future, stepping down from all of that and choosing to associate himself with them. And so, uh, Nordhaus wrote in his book, "Authentic leaders know their true north." I think you could say of Moses that, of course, amidst all of his flaws, he knew his true north. He knew to connect himself to. I've often wondered how Moses ever had influence with his Israelite slave brothers and sisters. I think this is the reason why, because he associated himself with them. Bill George's authentic leadership approach uses a very helpful figure in page 223 of our book that illustrates 5 dimensions. Those dimensions are purpose, values, relationships, self discipline, and heart. And so it took a great sense and conviction of all 5 of these, really, in order for Moses to identify with slaves. And so, again, purpose, values, relationships, self discipline, and heart. Moses shows all these in a great way. What a great example of utilizing the authentic approach to leadership. Let's go ahead now, and our third approach is the transformational approach. Um, what kind of transformational leadership skills it really would have taken to disrupt 400 years of slavery within the most powerful empire in the known world, Egypt? It's crazy to think that now, for 20 generations or more, um, God's chosen people have been in bondage. And so this is more than just um, a group of people that were put into bondage and knew that would be soon out. No, we're talking about a people that have a a poor history of 400 years of being homeless, of being slaves. And so this was not anything but, at this point, a way of life for God's people. And so, no doubt, they had lost their faith in God and they had forgotten his promises. Slavery, bondage, they were really just a way of life. Moses had to inspire these people. Think about that. Had to inspire these people to believe in not only freedom from Egyptians, but beyond that, to put their faith in God and to give them a land that was long ago promised to them and their patriarchs. So the transformational approach, as described by Nordhaus, is, and I quote, it's concerned with the process of how certain leaders are able to inspire followers to accomplish great things. I think we can all agree that Moses inspired his followers, whether it be getting them out of Egypt and experiencing freedom that God had to offer, and then also to believe God for great things, to believe God for a land of their very own, that they would not have to uh, get or attain on their own, but that God would place essentially in their laps. Leaders like these are recognized, as Nordhaus describes, as change agents. And I quote, who can create and articulate a clear vision for an organization, who empower followers to meet higher standards, who act in ways that make others want to trust them, and who give meaning to organizational life. So life gets more difficult before it gets better, and this would be the truth and the case for the Israelites. And really, after they had been um, liberated from Egypt, the nearsighted Israelites let Moses have it. The Bible, or uh, um, the Bible describes how the people vented their indignation and hatred towards Moses and towards Aaron, really to the point where Moses fears for his life. Most men would have quit at this point, with a couple million people angry at him and wanting him to be stoned. But what does Moses do? Well, Moses had uh, um, a greater vision for God's people than they had for themselves. And so leaders often quit or jump when they see greener grass. But what did Moses do? He dug his heels in and decided that by God's grace and him putting his faith in God, he was going to lead these people through the wilderness and through the struggles that they dealt with. And so they met opposition, and God would use Moses to conquer. And so, and to get through those things. Imagine, really, I guess you could imagine what kind of pressure Moses felt. I think about Moses and I think, wow, what a man that really um, shows a great deal of vision, as even in the face of death, tries to give people a vision of who God is and what their lives could look like if they were to follow his leadership, follow his guidance, and the clear mandates of God's will and eventually his word by the handwriting and the law of Moses. And let's see here, we'll look at the fourth theory, and that is the servant leader approach. The servant leader puts the needs of his followers ahead of his own. He shows sympathy, he empathizes with them. Of course, Moses shows empathy in his prayers to God for them, in his willingness to suffer on their account. Moses sticks his neck out for his followers in Exodus chapter 32. And Moses knew how serious God takes idolatry, and yet he says um, to the people in Exodus 32, verse number 30, ye have sinned a great sin, and now I will go up unto the Lord. Peradventure, I shall make an atonement for your sin. I don't think that really the people understood what he meant when he said he'd go make an atonement for their sin. I don't think that they understood the price that Moses was willing to pay here with regards to their sin. Really a type of Christ in many ways, but it was there in his communication with God where Moses' heart is seen, and he says to God, yet now if thou wilt forgive their sin, and if not, blot me, I pray thee, out of thy book which thou hast written. And so God also uses Moses to give them food and give them water. So he meets their needs in a servant leadership way. He sees their needs and wants to meet them. And also, he guides them, guides his followers out of Egypt through the wilderness, and desires to protect them from the imminent dangers that are all around him. Let's go ahead now and look at the last approach, and that's going to be the leader member exchange theory. And Moses, he really fostered a super close relationship with certain individuals, and those individuals end up strengthening him and strengthening one another and being strengthened for great positions in leadership as well as they serve God, as they serve their fellow man, the Israelites. Um, Moses bore a great deal of responsibility and weight as the leader of the Israelites. But I want us to think about his special relationship with people like Aaron, people like Hur, that both of them held up his hands and were given opportunities of leadership and uh, opportunities to grow their direct relationships with Moses and become greater people and better use people for it. Moses also, his ministry and the lives of the Israelites benefited from his relationship with many people. I think about Joshua and I think about Caleb, and they also represent individuals that really benefited here. They became stronger because of Moses' leadership, and God used Moses to delegate responsibilities. I also think about judges that were appointed, and really, he learns, as Sanders describes, the art of delegation when he goes to his father in law, Jethro, and says, "Man, what do I do here? I don't have enough time in the day, and the Israelites are becoming short with me because they're sitting around waiting as if they'd be waiting at the DMV just to have just a moment with me to deal with the matters of my life." And so Jethro says, "Hey, man, why don't you use the people that are around you that want to serve, that are very intelligent and capable people?" So God uses him to encourage Moses. The interesting thing about his advice is that Moses takes the advice and runs with it, and the people of God are strengthened for it. And so Moses shows a great deal of really just shows a great deal of wisdom in utilizing the opportunity that he has there with Jethro's advice. In closing, I'd just like to say that leadership is something that's given. Leadership is something that is also achieved. It's worked towards. You look at the life of Moses, and you look at these pictures here, really areas that I haven't even discussed, and yet great pivotal moments in human history. No doubt, God gave Moses huge influence and leadership opportunities. He had great leadership potential as well if he would grow and utilize them. And so Moses used his influence. Moses grew his leadership skills and practices, something that I desire to do myself. This class has been a great help to me in that way. Ultimately, all of our lives, and Moses included, our lives are to glorify the Lord. And as we gain positions of influence and leadership, may He do just that with us. Thank you so much for taking your time to listen to my presentation today.